Sure. Well, this started with my series, Sex, Drugs, and the Vatican, which is kind of a continuation off of what I was doing before in terms of basically the connections with Panama and Vietnam and Operation Condor that occurred in South America, and how this policy that largely was coming out of the CIA, but as we're going to see with this presentation, the CIA wasn't the one that brainstormed this kind of Gladio international network. And, basically the Vatican now comes into the story. And I prepared a bit of a slideshow for people because it's a lot of information. Even for myself, I have to refer to make sure that, things are accurate with what I'm stating, because it's a super heavy, dense subject.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of researchers have been talking about this. So I'm surprised actually with how many people I'm encountering that have like bits and pieces of it. So it's not revelatory from that standpoint, but to put it all together, I think it is still a task. So we can start with basically just a quick historical overview for people that during the 19th and 20th century, you had the British Empire, which was the largest empire in history. And one of the things that the British Empire did was it had a cotton monopoly, but it could only achieve that cotton monopoly through basically going into India, which was its major competitor. And you're going to see this as an ongoing theme, that it was never about free competition or anything resembling free market or free trade. But in fact, they were going after competitors and they were, very violently taking them out. So India was the competition for the cotton monopoly in the world. And so they went in and they destroyed India's textiles. And not only that, but in place, made India an opium producer. The south of the United States is also implicated in Britain's form of cotton monopoly, which again was really based on slave labor. That's what was basically the plantations in the south. The cotton plantations were in service to the British Empire, and even though they say that they stopped slavery, the reality was that throughout their colonies, slavery still existed, and within Britain, people didn't have a choice whether they worked in a factory or not. So it wasn't really, free rights from that standpoint. And that's why the trade unions came in later on, because people really didn't have any kind of working rights. So India becomes a producer in opium, and then this opium is sold throughout the world, but also largely to China. And that was what the two opium wars were about, was because according to free trade, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations approach or argument, which was never an argument that Britain actually conducted themselves by. They had the right to trade in opium to China, which China was refusing because obviously it had devastating effects in terms of addiction. And that's what the two opium wars are fought over. So as a result of that, can we see the next slide? We do. Okay, perfect. As a result of the China losing the two opium wars, Britain basically takes possession of several ports. Among these ports are Shanghai, which is circled on the map, and Hong Kong. And as we will see, HSBC was created as a bank to basically trade in opium. So this is a City of London bank that is called the Hong Kong Shanghai British Corporation, I believe. Yeah, well, Banking Corporation. Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, but it's a bank that is headquartered in City of London. It's a City of London bank. Right. And if you notice on this $100 bill, which again, the Chinese currency is in yuan, so Hong Kong has a different currency. The reason for this is, again, Hong Kong was a colony under Britain for 99 years, so it was only released back to China in the late 90s. But to this day, China does not actually have full control over the currency printing in Hong Kong. So HSBC controls 1/3 of the currency that's printed in Hong Kong, which is a different currency from China. And the Standard Chartered Bank, which is another City of London bank, has control over the other third. And it's only Bank of China, which is a a Chinese bank which has control over the other third. So 2/3 of Hong Kong's currency to this day is still controlled by a City of London bank, City of London banks. And both of these banks have been caught numerous times recently in heroin trafficking, amongst other things, which I'll go over a little bit in later on.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So what did I want to say on top of that? Right. So the City of London, just for people to also know, it is not something that's under the jurisdiction of the British government, right? So the British government doesn't have the authority to go into the City of London and to basically, intervene or even do a proper investigation into how banking occurs in the City of London. And as you're going to see, this actually has a lot in common with the Vatican and the Jesuits who, the Templars are supposed to have set up the first bank. We're going to see how a lot of this is tied into things, but the Templars had started the first bank in London, and a lot of this is kind of modeled off of what ultimately is a sort of Vatican structure. So the Jesuit order is also something that was very business oriented, and they are basically in service to the Vatican. They have privileges that I don't think any other branch, Catholic branch has, except for Opus Dei. And they basically kind of have like free, they're able to do whatever, execute whatever they want under the Vatican, no matter where they are in the world. So I wanted to share with people, and if there's any questions, Mel, because I know that's going to be a lot to go over. Because again, for people to know that the Jesuits have a banking function from the Vatican as well, which is going to be a really big deal when we start to talk about their role in Vietnam and the heroin trade that ultimately was out of that. So Peter Dale Scott, he's very well-respected researcher. He wrote in the foreword to a terrific book by Henrik Kruger, The Great Heroin Coup. Peter Dale Scott writes, before World War II, the Kuomintang, which is KMT is the acronym for it, regime in China was perhaps the best example of political manipulation of the narcotics traffic under the guise of an opium suppression campaign. So they were actually producing opium under the guise of suppressing opium.
That sounds familiar. Yeah.
To finance both a political and an intelligence apparatus under General Tai Li. This practice spread after World War II to a number of WACL member countries, which is, I think it's World Anti-Communist League member countries and groups. Today, which at the time he was writing this is in 1980, there is cause to fear that Nixon's super agency, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, has, like other narcotics enforcement agencies before it, come to use corrupt personnel who are actually part of the traffic as part of a covert war against revolution. So I want to clarify something very important in this statement, which a lot of people might not be aware of. China was, so during World War II, China was fighting a lot. So the Japanese war against China was something that started back in the late 1800s. Korea also was devastated by Japanese invasion. By then, Taiwan also was ruled under a Japanese occupation. So during World War II, China was fighting against the Japanese, but they were also fighting a civil war. And the civil war was basically, a lot of communists actually were part of the Kuomintang originally. This is the party of Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic, which now today we have both Taiwan and China, who are both claiming to be the true continuation of Sun Yat-sen, who was very influenced by Lincoln, and he was trained by Americans in Hawaii. He was someone he identified as Christian and Confucius. So when he died, there was basically fighting, and the Kuomintang split, and there was a civil war that came about, and it was the Kuomintang under General Chiang Kai-shek and basically what became the communists under Mao Zedong. And what people have to realize is that what Peter Dale Scott is referring to when he's saying Kuomintang at this point, because Chiang Kai-shek had the backing of the OSS, the American intelligence that would later become the CIA.
Right.
I'm going to explain more of this. I know it's a lot right now.
No, I love it. Yeah.
Basically, Chiang Kai-shek, the Americans were also known to be complaining about Chiang Kai-shek because they were backing Chiang Kai-shek because he had the official recognition by Sun Yat-sen. Later on, Sun Yat-sen's wife, by the way, recognizes Mao Zedong over Chiang Kai-shek. But anyway, he has the American backing, but the Americans are there because they want to fight the Japanese fascists. They don't have an interest in the Civil War. At least that's not the official reason why they're there. So you have people like General Wedemeyer, General Stilwell, who are on record complaining about Chiang Kai-shek because he was basically not fighting the Japanese fascists during World War II, and he was instead doing a lot of actions that were against the Chinese people in a way that he thought was going to help him come out on top. And he was known for burning whole cities down with people in them. And he would use excuses like, oh, the Japanese were going to use it for their own resources. He was, that kind of a person. So there were a lot of Americans who were actually worried that he possibly was going to side with the Japanese fascists as well. So there was that sort of thing too, that they were trying to appease to get him to favor the United States. Anyway, he ends up losing the Civil War, and he goes to Taiwan, which is an island. And that was basically his government was in Taiwan from that point on. So all of this Kuomintang drug stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next, few slides, this is Taiwan. This is under Chiang Kai-shek's government, which is completely separate from the mainland Chinese government. And that's why it now is explained why you would have the World Anti-Communist League, right. That was pretty much, Kuomintang were the leading members in this. Why it was anti-communist, it's because it was Chiang Kai-shek's section. So this is a massive quote from Peter Dale Scott, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to keep it up here for anyone who wants to pause and read the whole thing. This is again from the intro to Henrik Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup. But again, Peter Dale Scott makes the point that Ty Lee, who is basically the guy who started a sort of a secret police state under General Chiang Kai-shek, he's also the one who started working with the Green Gang, the notorious Green Gang. As we're going to see, the triads are also going to be connected in with the Kuomintang channels, which would continue to work with the bad channels of the OSS and the CIA, because I don't want to make it sound like everybody in the OSS and the CIA were in on it, but those basically who were following under Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner and so forth, this OPC grouping, they were working with these kinds of channels. And what's very interesting is Peter Dale Scott himself says that this China lobby, the WACL, was claiming that the drugs were coming out of communist China, when in fact they were working in the channels I was just talking about. And he's saying in bold here in the second paragraph, thus challenging the official Narcotics Bureau myth that Kuomintang dope in this country was communist Chinese. There's also problems with San Francisco. And again, there's a lot of Kuomintang activity in San Francisco. So they're already in the United States this early on. And Peter Dale Scott is talking about George White, who is a Federal Bureau of Narcotics official, former OSS agent. And he was in charge of investigating these San Francisco opium dealing gangs that were connected to Kuomintang. And he found that White was implicated also in leading LSD experiments in Project MK Ultra. And there's going to be, I need to do more work on this, but there's clearly some eerie connection between the Jesuits with MK Ultra and the Vatican, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I have it in my series. The Vatican even owned a pharmaceutical company where they were found selling this contraceptive. I think the pharmaceutical company's name is Serono, which now is bought by Merck.
Yeah.
But they were selling this contraceptive to women for dysfunction, but I don't think they were telling the women that it was a contraceptive. So that was like extremely controversial. But I have a feeling that they were manufacturing other drugs that probably were also implicated in MK Ultra activity. But I have to look into it more to really prove that. But it's my suspicion. And so Peter Dale Scott continues, by 1951, the CIA was closely allied with the Kuomintang drug operations in Burma and Yunnan through a Miami-based proprietary Sea Supply Inc., organized by Paul Helliwell. So Paul Helliwell is very central OSS guy that is really leading this this network that's starting to arise. We have the Corsican Mafia that was already in Vietnam as well, French Mafia, but as we're going to see, the Vietnam War was actually a territory fight over who was going to control the heroin. Is there anything else in here? Yeah, again, he's just saying at the end, the Kuomintang were erased. So you have this Chong Wing Fong, former Hip Sing president. So that's the gang in San Francisco that is connected with Kuomintang. Scott says that he was brought to Hong Kong. Again, so see, Hong Kong is a real hotbed for these Chinese opium gangs because, again, Hong Kong was not in the jurisdiction of China. It was a British colony during this time. So people have to be aware of that. So Peter Dale Scott says in 1953 to 1954, the CIA drew on old China hands, in other words, the OSS men who worked in China, with exposure to Kuomintang traffic. So these are OSS guys: Chenot, William Pauly, Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt is famous for the Watergate, one of the Watergate plumbers. Yeah. He would also be later on in Guatemala, overthrew the Arbenz government because the Arbenz government was threatening the United Fruit Company's ownership of land in Guatemala, and the United Fruit Company.
The United Fruit Company before too on this show, so
yeah,
so it all connects back.
It's heavily implicated, and do I need to read any of that? Helping in 1954 to set up what would eventually become the Latin American branch of the Kuomintang-backed World Anti-Communist League. And people should keep in mind that the Saigon military mission started that same year in 1954. So what this is this is like the United States coming in with Edward Lansdale, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next slide. Edward Lansdale is leading the Saigon military mission, which is known now was a parapsychological terrorist network that led to the Phoenix program, which has a lot of Orwellian aspects to it. And I read somewhere, I have to look into it more, that there seems to be connection with the Phoenix program and the Tavistock Institute. So anyway, you have the American presence that's coming in with the Saigon military mission. I'm actually going to go to the next slide. It's going to be easier for people. So you have Edward Lansdale, who is coming in, and with the Saigon military mission, a huge aspect of this, besides practicing psychological terror tactics, which he was already doing in the Philippines too. Like, he would do things like, there's this myth in the Philippines of a vampire type of creature, and he would drain people of blood by hanging them upside down, and then they'd leave their bodies with puncture marks on the neck, drained of blood, for people to find, to spread this kind of thing. He was very creative and odd with the kind of things he would come up with, but also extremely effective, the ones that were used. So part of his other mission with the Saigon military mission is actually to take the heroin channels from the Corsican Mafia. And Lucien Conan, who is a French legionnaire, but he, for whatever reason, defected, and he went over to the CIA. I don't know why he chose to do that. And he was very close to a lot of these Corsican mafia people. So he knew all of the locations, how the network worked and everything. And he screwed them over completely and gave all of this information to Edward Lansdale. And Edward Lansdale was able to take over this territory over time. People have to remember too, Vietnam was a French colony. So the French, after World War II, a lot of countries were like understood that the war was fought not just against fascism, but against colonialism. So a lot of these countries that were colonies who had fought. So like in the case of Vietnam, they were fighting the Japanese fascists, and so they thought they were going to be rewarded with independence. And Ho Chi Minh actually quotes the American Declaration of Independence as part of Vietnam's Declaration of Independence. So, and he was working with the OSS in fighting against the Japanese fascists. So, when all of these things started to happen, a lot of these empires, the French and the British, especially, the Dutch also were not great. Were going back into these places, and so France almost immediately starts a war with Vietnam right after World War II to reclaim their colonial assets, and they're not doing a very good job. People have to also understand that Vietnam have been fighting the French since the 1800s, so it wasn't something that happened like all of a sudden. Right. So there were already a lot of like networks and underground channels for the Vietnam nationalists, and anyway, the French were not doing so good, and that's why they brought in the Americans, thinking the Americans were going to help them reclaim their colonial assets, and they had to go to, Algeria, because there was also that infamous rebellion in Algeria that the French had to deal with, which de Gaulle was the one who said France should give up this colony, and that's when he started to get a lot of assassination attempts against him, the president of France. Right. So again, another part of this grouping, which is really important, is Claire Chenot. His wife is actually Anna Chen Chenot, who was the head of the Kuomintang lobby. So again, you see that there is a lot of intermingling at this point with the Taiwanese Chinese. So the Taiwanese Chinese are like ethnically Chinese, but they're a completely different government, different political idea of what things should be. And the Taiwanese government under Chiang Kai-shek, I should make clear as well, they thought that they were the true government of all of China. So they wanted to be internationally recognized as the government of mainland China as well. So another thing here is that, so the Golden Triangle is truly a product of the Kuomintang OSS CIA network. I'll try to explain a little bit of the Vatican's implications in this. This is namely the Jesuit presence in French Vietnam. This is what started the whole French business in Vietnam, was through the Jesuits, who are businessmen as well. And a lot of the drugs and stuff are going to be going through the Vatican Bank, which is established by Pope Pius XII in World War II in 1942. The Vatican Bank, not that they didn't have a bank before this, because again, the Templars were the first bank in London. They had a Crusader banking system that they had set up, but this was like very official, the Vatican Bank. And they were given, back their sovereign status by Mussolini. And so the Vatican Bank was going to be, again, like a city of London, where to this day, the Vatican Bank, as I'm going to mention a few examples, really big examples, they've been caught and we can't do anything about it. The Italian government has tried many times to sentence certain archbishops and cardinals to prison for being involved in banking fraud, and we just don't have the jurisdiction for it. I don't know about recently, because I'm going through just the historical part, and this is actually all new for me, but I remember there is, with Pope Francis, there was something recently that happened, and again, he denied any ability to investigate into it.
It was gone. This is Big
Yeah,
time.
it's ongoing and it's really
Right.
frustrating because as you're going to see, this has totally gutted the Italian economy. So the Vatican has actually been a parasite
Right.
off of the Italian economy because they buy up banks and then they bankrupt them
Right.
and the money goes missing. I'm going to talk about the details of this in a second. So yeah, you have the Golden Triangle, and the Golden Triangle was the largest opium producing area of the world from the 1950s up until like about the 2000s, and it was moved to Afghanistan
Right.
area later on. But it's been the huge hub of heroin production for several decades and has done a lot of devastation.
Sure.
Here's just to give people an idea of how much Chiang Kai-shek was favored by Henry Luce, the owner of Time magazine and Life magazine. People should be aware that Henry Luce was clearly working with the CIA, working with Alan Dulles.
I think they
Act-
still are the Time
oh yeah, yeah.
Mag. I mean,
And
come
I
on.
think it was the Life magazine where the Zapruder film was
Right.
kept in the
Exactly.
safe of Life magazine. So that just tells you how high up
Exactly.
and
Totally.
implicated they are in all of this.